Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a continuing education course with Agents of Change. Today, we have Hillary joining us to give us a better understanding of rights under the ADA, specifically in the workplace as well as with children. So, we'll be touching on these two topics. And as we get started here for this 1 hour credit, I'll go ahead and introduce myself and Hillary so that you all can understand our backgrounds a little bit better. So, I myself am an Agents of Change team member here to bring you more information here on this course and all of the courses that we have. I do have a background in social work and various backgrounds serving foster children, migration, as well as children to adults in mental health. So learning about ADA today is so important because the clients that we're serving need accommodations and there's disabilities that are coming across us. So I hope that this course is very insightful for you as we touch on some of these questions here with Hillary. And to learn more about Hillary, Hillary does have a nursing background with a bachelor's in science of nursing, as well as a master's in science and a master's in business administration. And she has over 25 years of experience in occupational health, specifically with disability management, leave administration, as well as ADA. So we're going to get to learn a lot about this here today. And we're really excited because there can be lots of things that come to our office or our virtual space with our clients. So we're really excited to talk to Hillary today. We'll really get to draw in on her experience to help you all better understand ADA rights, protections, and the workplace accommodation process as well. So we'll go ahead and have a conversation around this, and you all will get to earn 1 credit CE here for your license to renew whenever that comes up with us. So thank you all for joining. Hillary, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to mention some things about yourself if you'd like to add before we get started.
Sure. First of all, I'm very excited to talk about this topic because I really feel it provides such protections with the goal of someone being able to fully do all the essential functions of their job. So, this is a very, very important law, and it falls under the Equal Rights Amendments and under the EEOC. And I'm looking forward to our dialogue.
Yes, thank you so much. And we'll get into why this is so important for us, especially as clinicians across the board from social work to licensed professional counselors and even family therapists as well. So we want to, of course, understand the key ADA provisions here. Understanding this really helps us recognize the rights of individuals as our clients that are coming into our office, or maybe families if we're doing family practice, couples practice, anything like that. But we'll be able to understand these rights with disabilities and the responsibilities of employers as well in creating equitable workspaces. And this knowledge will help us identify potential barriers, provide more informed support for our clients, and promote greater access to inclusion. So as we move through this, we're definitely learning on this material here. We'll also be able to navigate workplace accommodation process. So of course, this can be really confusing and even overwhelming for the client themselves or us as clinicians trying to provide this support for them when it's not our specific work. So we're hoping that you take a lot away from today to better serve your clients. Understanding these steps that can help better guide your clients through this process, support effective communication, and reduce any barriers that are obtaining to appropriate accommodations that are here as well. We'll also be able to strengthen your role as clinicians to support your individual clients with disabilities through advocacy, as that's a big role for us, education, and system level change as well. So, really strengthening your role to help you all empower your clients, promote disability inclusive practices, and encourage more responsible, equitable workspaces, which is so important for our clients as they're seeking these services with us before or even after, and making sure that they have a clear understanding of these things. So, of course, to get into this and learn more about this topic, Um, can you tell us a little bit about what is ADA and these workplace accommodations?
Absolutely. The ADA, which stands for the Americans with Disability Act, was signed into law in 1990. And it is designed to provide protections to workers, to access to public spaces, and in education. So it's very, very broad reaching. My background is working with in the employment arena and how the ADA provides valuable protections to employees in all sizes of corporations across the United States. It's a civil rights law, as I mentioned, and the ADA definition of a disability is very, very important. It is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And we will get into that a little further. But the ADA is very, very broad when they define major life activities. It is a vast list that includes things such as walking, sleeping, breathing. So the important thing for a social worker to know, it is a very broad definition that defines disability. It also encompasses mental health. So many of the things we will be talking about might not be something that you typically think of a disability as seeing someone in a wheelchair. Most people get that, okay, it's a public space, they have to have a ramp. The ADA, yes, includes that, but it's far broader in its protections um, to your clients. It's also very important to know that your client might not know about the ADA, and many people don't. It is not common to know that. So, we'll get into some specific ways about how a social worker can serve as an advocate and what are some of the clues that someone you are counseling may need an accommodation.
Yes, and thank you for sharing on that. We'll definitely be jumping into these things as they're so important for us to understand. And with this being said, what is the most commonly misunderstood thing about the ADA?
One of the most common misconceptions, particularly from an employer side, is that this is an onerous and expensive process. In actuality, in the employment arena, the average ADA accommodation only costs $300. Some of them don't cost anything. And as we probe deeper, you will see it's not an onerous process. I look at it as a great process for an employer. If you can get to a win-win situation where approving and applying a reasonable accommodation keeps an employee gainfully employed and successful in their job, that's a win-win. I mentioned the term reasonable accommodation, and there are two very important terms when we talk about ADA. A reasonable accommodation means it needs to be something that an employer can reasonably approve. And we'll get into more detail, but you'll hear that term a lot, reasonable accommodation. The other term you hear a lot is essential function of a job. Is it something that is a core responsibility and that is an essential function of their job? So, as we get into it, two key concepts to understand. And and we'll explain further. Okay, so I explained for employers what the most common misconception is. For employees, I have found the most common misconception is they don't even know the ADA exists. And I think there's a huge opportunity for the social worker to explain and be the advocate for the employee that many just don't know about it. And the same would be true about parents of children. They're just not aware that the ADA provides these protections.
Yes, definitely. And it's so important for us to be aware of this. And so I'm glad that we're able to clear up some of this information here on these misconceptions and then get into better detail on some of those things that you mentioned as far as reasonable accommodations and things like that. So ADA defines disability as an impairment that is something that limits one or more major life activities. And you were kind of explaining some of this at the beginning, but can we get a look at what does this look like in practice, especially when a disability is not visible, especially as you were mentioning that wheelchair compared to what we see come into our offices.
Absolutely. And I think it's pretty clear when a disability is visible. Someone is in a wheelchair, someone is blind, someone has hearing aids. Those are very easy for an employer, a social worker, an educator to see a visible disability. The ADA also applies to disabilities that are not visible, such as mental health, such as sleeping disorders. Another one, as we're seeing people living with cancer, cancer is now sometimes viewed as a chronic condition, depending on the diagnosis. And there are many people under treatment who are successfully working with cancer, but may need an accommodation. But you might not see that. You know, the cancer is not visible to you. The mental illness is not visible in the same way a wheelchair or a walker or a hearing aid is visible. So know that the ADA covers all disabilities and that all are treated equally and can request an accommodation. So I mentioned sleeping is one that is covered. It's certainly not visible. And how it comes to play in the work environment, I've seen several different scenarios. I've seen people with sleeping disorders that need a later starting time. And that would be an appropriate accommodation that a social worker might identify, and that would be something that they can submit a request under the ADA. It could be a sleeping disorder due to, I've had many cases where the employees are taking medical marijuana to assist them with their sleeping. Lots of concerns from employees around that. Am I going to be drug tested? Lots of concerns about starting times. Can I start later? Because when I finally fall asleep, it's very difficult for me to do a 7 to 3 shift. It could be, I've seen this one where they're on a mental health medication and they might need time to take it and time for that to take effect. It could be someone with a managing a chronic cancer situation where they are also taking medication in the morning and need time for that medication to adjust in their system. So those would be examples of non-visible non-visible qualified disabilities to submit a request under the ADA.
Definitely. And sometimes there's even fluctuating conditions. As you mentioned, cancer, there could be chronic conditions or flare-ups, right? Where there could be some assistance there. Can you explain some of that?
Yes, and that is not unusual in chronic conditions to have good days and bad days. And that is why in the ADA, requests can be submitted for um, intermittent days off. The ADA also covers leave under the ADA, and that's also something that most people aren't aware of, that leave can be an accommodation. And you say, well, how would a leave allow you to do the essential functions of your job? Well, you might need a leave when you're having a flare up. An employee might need a day or two to rest and recover while that flare up is in the acute stage. Or it might be a smaller intermittent thing. The employee might be getting IV infusions or chemotherapy or radiation and need a block of time or a part of a day. You know, they may be able to come to work in the morning, but they may be going for the radiation in the afternoon. So the ADA allows for those type of situations. So it could be an ADA accommodation could be something as clear as someone needs a lifting accommodation. They have a physical job, they can lift 20 pounds, but the job requires 30 pounds. They would apply for an accommodation under the ADA for a lifting device to allow them to fully do the essential functions of their jobs. There's that term again, essential functions. If you work in a warehouse and an essential function is lifting 30 pounds and you can only lift 20 for a covered reason under the ADA, you would apply for an accommodation under the ADA.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that because it is important to be aware of those little things and asking for these accommodations. Now, there can be something that kind of crosses here with
Oh, yes.
what what professionals can be careful not to assume based on how an employee appears to be functioning. And I like how you mentioned that 30 pounds versus 20, it seems like it's not much, but it's definitely something so important when it comes to our health, physically, mentally, and all of that. So could you kind of share with us what
Absolutely.
professionals can be careful with?
Yes, we have to be very, very careful that we don't judge by just looking at someone and saying they look fine. Well, that is on the outside. We don't know what is going on with every employee and what needs they have that are covered under the ADA. That someone might look very fit to a casual observer, but they might have rheumatoid arthritis. And you're not going to see that. But they would have, painful joints, difficulty lifting. They may need longer breaks if they are working in a physical job. So I guess the biggest thing I can say is don't jump to conclusions just by looking at someone. And the same with mental health. We don't know if someone has been diagnosed on the spectrum, they might need different instructions as to how to do a task. I've had requests where, depending on their diagnosis, they did not do well with video instructions. Their request was for one on one time and to demonstrate that they could do something. that's a reasonable request for an accommodation. Cost minimal to do that kind of training. But again, that could be a win-win in having an employee be successful on the job and keeping them gainfully employed. Things like employees that do better with being allowed to write down the steps of a process and having a handbook to go with it. Very different than how at least large companies that I've been affiliated with had tended to go to video training. You go to video training, you're assigned it, you do it. Certain employees, that does not work well based on their diagnoses. And that's something for an employer to be aware of or an educator to be aware of, that a child may not be learning in the same way. A child may need more time to take a test, that they know the material, but they need extra time. That is something you see in the educational system under the ADA. And that's certainly something that a social worker could advocate for.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we mentioned a little bit about some differences between accommodation and restriction. So can you
Yes,
explain this difference between and why it matters?
yes, yes. And it's a subtle but clear difference. So the ADA is something that enables one to do the essential functions of their job. So in the ADA, going back to the lifting example, we've got a gentleman that's 65 years old. He has osteoarthritis. He can lift the 20 pounds. He can't lift the 30 pounds. He's a warehouse worker. Lifting 30 pounds is required in his job. He would apply for an ADA request for a device that will assist him in lifting so he can do the job fully. A restriction for lifting would be someone who goes out for shoulder surgery. Same job, required to lift 30 pounds. But when they're in that acute period of recovery, but yet back at work, they would apply for a restriction that they would be excused for a period of time from doing the lifting. So a restriction is usually time sensitive. An ADA request generally can be approved for a year at a time and re-reviewed. A restriction is time limited. It would be approved for the period that this gentleman is recovering from shoulder surgery. In both cases, ADA and restrictions, you need medical documentation to support it. And that's a very clear written. In the case of the gentleman who had surgery, that note would come from his surgeon. So it's the person who's treating him for that condition. In the ADA, particularly for those disabilities that are not visible, the ADA, that note might come from a social worker. It doesn't have to be a physician. The restriction would have to be a physician. That's a physical diagnosis, shoulder surgery, can't lift for 3 months, whatever. But under the ADA, a social worker can submit what's called the medical justification of what is the life activity that's impacted and and what is the request. So that's very, very important that the social worker can play a very valuable role. And the same with children, that a social worker can submit that request for longer time for test taking.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. And that there comes that next question of what this process looks like for us as clinicians and social workers. So can you walk us through what
Yeah.
this accommodation process would
And
look like?
I'm going to walk you through best practice, and I'll walk you through the steps that I followed. However, it's important to understand that everyone does not work for a large corporation. So, large corporations have experts on staff, such as myself, or they can be using a vendor to review these things. So, I will talk about best practice. The important thing that the EEOC looks at if they're ever reviewing concerns, did you follow a consistent practice for all employees? Did you follow the same steps? Did you treat everyone equally? Did you go through the interactive process? That's what they're looking at. So, in best practice, the social worker identifies that someone would benefit from an ADA request. And that's an important term, too. It's a request. It's not an automatic approval, it's a request. And in fact, many times, the first ADA accommodation that's requested might not be what's approved. There's a back and forth and an interactive process of what can meet the employee's needs and what can meet the employer. And you want to come to an understanding and have a win win for everyone and have everyone on board. So the first thing is identifying there's a potential ADA request here. Employee is coming in, they're consistently late for work. The client is telling you their job is in jeopardy. It would be a great opening to say, have you ever submitted a request under the ADA? What's causing you to be late? What is and if it's I missed the bus, well, that's not the ADA. But if it's I keep missing the bus because I'm oversleeping, because I have, this diagnosis, and then that's where the social worker probes. Large corporations that I work with have ADA forms. And at that point, the social worker would refer the employee to their HR or their manager to say, I'd like to request an accommodation under the ADA. Can you provide me the paperwork that I need for my social worker or my physician or my nurse practitioner? And the employee would get that paperwork and bring it, in this case, back to the social worker who would fill it out. The medical is confidential and has to be treated with confidentiality. Under the ADA, there is a requirement that that medical cannot be kept in a regular employee file. It's got to be kept in a separate, secure location. Many times people say, well, what's needed? And what is needed is the medical related to this accommodation. So it would not be the entire history and physical of, of the client. It's specifically related. It would not be a physician sending copious amounts of notes, including things that are irrelevant, like patient regularly uses marijuana. If that's not relevant to the request, it shouldn't be submitted. This is very different than someone applying for disability. Someone applying for disability or long term disability, you are going to have to submit copious notes to substantiate that. And there might even be x rays and, second opinions and things like that. That is not the ADA. Just stick with what's related what major life impact is impacted. In the ADA, less is more. If the company needs more, they will ask for it. But in general, just stick to the basics. So then the company, the employee brings in the form, or the healthcare provider faxes it in. Surprisingly, in the disability space, faxes are considered a secure transmission, more so than emails. Um, but either way is fine, snail mail, whatever, as long as it gets in. And then the HR kicks off the process. And again, this is in a large corporation. I'm describing best practice. In a large corporation, there is a disability department, typically an integrated disability department. And integration means that they are seeing all leaves that this particular employee might have. And they would convene a meeting of the ADA committee. In my experience, the members of the ADA committee would be the employee's HR, the the representative from the disability department, the lawyer, and if the company has a medical clinic, they may be included as well. Best practice would be to have regularly scheduled meetings so the employees get timely responses, there's not an extensive waiting period, and the HR will also interview the manager and obtain a copy of the job description and look at the essential functions of the job against what the request is and can it be accommodated. The committee would meet and review, and if they couldn't accommodate the exact request, then they would start getting creative. And what can we accommodate? What portion of this? An example might be work at home. That's one that has come up very, very commonly since COVID, because during COVID, many employees were allowed to work at home, and then companies brought them back at work. If an employee could not be fully accommodated 5 days a week at home, and maybe it was one of those intermittent requests that we discussed, could they come to a win-win that when the employee was having a flare-up, that they could work at home for those 2 days or so to get that under control? So that's where the interactive process comes. You never want, as a corporation, to just say no. No, no. You always follow consistent process. You treat each request that goes to the committee to review it. It's also best practice in large corporations to have written policies. So employees have an online policy handbook. And in that policy handbook, it would have an ADA policy, an FMLA policy, family and medical leave policy, any other time that's available to them. So the employee, when meeting with the HR at the front of the process, can review that, can have something that can help them understand what's going on. And then you would act from the committee. Documentation is very important in the ADA. They would document their decision, and the employee would be told verbally and in writing of what the accommodation was.
Thank you. I know you mentioned it being so important to have meetings to keep this continuously going. What would be your recommended time for that, or just generally, what do you
Yeah, I,
see?
I worked in a large corporation with about 10,000 employees, and we had meetings monthly because that way it was on everybody's schedule. And so the employee would never, never have a long delay. If it was an urgent request, we would convene sooner but we had standing meetings monthly. It also allowed time for the research, the interactive process between the HR and the manager. You might get things like, well, I've never done that before. Well, that's not an acceptable answer. And let's work through, what are you concerned with? Would you agree to a trial basis? Would you agree to do this for 2 months and we'll revisit how it's working? So the interactive process is really meant that it's interactive between the employee and HR, the manager, HR, HR and the committee. What can we do? And it's also a corporate philosophy is so important. My company had the philosophy, we want to have disabled employees work for us and they add value. And if they can do all essential functions of their job, that is a win-win for everyone. So that was our corporate philosophy. Now, that's not to say every manager had that philosophy. So a lot of education. The other thing that we did is we had required annual ADA training. We had new managers, 10,000 employees all over the United States. So we had required new manager training and annual existing training. The ADA does not require that, but in my mind, it's best practice.
Yeah, most definitely. Always wanting to keep everyone updated or, new information to process, right? Not forgetting these things. And so my next question too was, what is the timeline you see for someone to be approved or denied to get that across?
Yes. Now, the ADA does not specify a timeline. However, you can imagine how anxious an employee is. So our goal was to do it within a 2 to 3 week time frame. And that was shared with the employee up front. If we could do it quicker, we did it quicker. Now, I've described a large corporation that has a dedicated, a lawyer on site, has clinics, has a disability department. A small company would have an HR, or if they don't have an HR in house, they would have an outsourced HR. And so they would still have to follow the same processes. What is the essential function of the job? Keeping that medical separate, doing an interactive process. It would just be a smaller group of people, and it might not be employees of the company. They might have an outsourced vendor. The key point is you have to do all those steps. You have to get the medical, you have to keep it confidential, you need the job description. If the request is not an essential function, for example, someone who has a fear of flying and only travels to local areas, they don't need an accommodation if they can drive. I mean, it's not needed. So that's an assessment too. Is what the employee requesting an essential function of their job? Yes or no? And then you go down different paths.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, there's this big mental health piece as clinicians and social workers as well. I've seen it myself, clients coming very upset, not having this break from work or having a break from work and feeling rushed back.
Yeah.
So, what are some workplace accommodations that people may not immediately think of, particularly with mental health conditions?
Okay. So one of the ones, and breaks do come up. And again, an employer is looking to accommodate, but how can you accommodate to get all the essential functions? So someone who needs longer breaks, an accommodation that managers are usually open to accepting is you extend their workday. So if the break is normally 10 minutes and they need 20 minutes, you either put that on at the beginning of the day or put that on at the end of the day. They are fully doing their job, but they are getting the breaks they need. So it's adjusting the time schedule. And that's one I've seen quite a bit. That also can come up with bathroom breaks, employees with GI conditions, and again, episodic and intermittent, but might need 25 minutes in the bathroom. Not every day, but might need that. And a win-win would be, okay, you need a 30-minute break. You make up that time at the end of the day or the next day. It depends on their medical condition.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you. And from your experiencing managing disability, leave, workers' compensation, and ADA programs, what happens when several systems overlap within the same employee?
It's a terrific question, and I would throw in there state leave as well. There are now 13 states and more coming on board, 13 states plus the District of Columbia that have paid state leaves and more coming on each year. So, how is an employee expected to know what they need? And my answer is they're not. They're expected to bring their need forward, and it's up to the professionals to determine which leave that they fall under. The ADA applies only to you, so it's only an accommodation for you. Other leaves, such as FMLA, can apply to family members. So I do not expect an employee to know which leave they fall under. They know what their need is. I don't even expect their mental health provider or their social worker or their doctor to know. The doctor or the provider or the social worker knows what the disability is and knows what the accommodation is that they're requesting. But it's really up to the employer to figure out what they're covered under. Now, I have had very savvy employees. I mentioned the policy and procedure manual, that they would look on their HR policies and read up on the leaves. But that's the exception. The average employee does not know what leaves they're under. And, as I said, and with state leaves, and I think they're wonderful because the more opportunities employees have to enable them to stay on the job, I think is great. But it's impossible for for the average. I have had a few lawyers know what leave to ask for, but most people do not.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult to wrap our head around that, especially when we're going through something of, um, going through a new diagnosis of a chronic illness or a disability, and it being so much information to take in yourself, and then having to deal with this as well, we needing these accommodations or needing that reasonable leave as well. So thank
You
you.
are spot on, Bonnie, that it is a very, very upsetting time and disturbing time when someone is dealing with a disability and they might be fearful of their job and they might have financial concerns that if they can't keep their job. I really look at the role of a disability department as being the navigator for them and saying, I'm here to help you with this process and I'm here to explain it to you. Now, again, that's best practice. We also talked about resources, and there's one in the ADA that is really terrific, and that's eeoc.gov. And that is a wonderful resource, not only for social workers, but also for someone who's thinking, is this ADA? Is this not ADA? It goes through simple scenarios and it explains one's rights. It's a very, very valuable resource, particularly for someone who might be in a small company who doesn't have that resource of an in-house disability department to help navigate.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so definitely looking at that resource on Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.gov if we're needing to look up that information for our clients or for ourselves.
Oh, it's a very, very, it's a great one.
Thank you for sharing that, and we'll share that resource here with our members to be aware of and to look into deeper if that's something that's needed.
Another one
Now,
that may be helpful, and this is, I don't work for the company, but it's called Ask Jan. Ask, ASKJAN, like the name. And what that site does, you can put in a condition and it will tell you a list of possible accommodations. And that's a very good one with mental health and the non-visible ones, because those tend to be a little harder than someone with, a mobility issue that might need a special chair or a special spot. So Ask Jan helps you with the thought process of what type of accommodation might I request.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. We'll definitely share these here. Now, of course, as social workers or clinicians, we are wanting to support our clients who are
Mhm.
afraid and requesting this. Would these be some of the sites that they can look for, or what are some other things that we can help navigate fear that comes with these requests?
Yeah. I think the EEOC is the best one to look at when it comes up to fear. And I want to stress this is a right, this is a law. And the EEOC site does a very, very nice job of going through that and what you should do if you feel your rights are violated. I always recommend trying to work through the system first with your employer, but there may be times that fails, and you would want to review that site to see what are your rights.
And what are some roles that we can help clients identify the difference between a workforce or workplace problem and a
Yeah.
disability related barrier?
Yeah, I mean, some are blatantly obvious. Someone who's not getting along with their boss, um, that's more of an HR issue and more of an interpersonal issue, very different than the ADA. With the ADA, I would look at the EEOC website and it lists all of those major activities that we've been talking about: walking, sleeping. It even has breathing. There are people who are asthmatics. I mean, it lists all of those. If it's not on that ADA list, then it's most likely not something that's covered under the ADA. So it's important to, probe with the client and discuss it. Is this a performance issue? Is this ADA? It has to affect one of the major life activities.
Yes. And that's some of the questions that we should be asking from the very beginning. I know as an intern, that was the first question we were asking in the hospital setting. What are you able to do or not able to
What are you?
do?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
making
What
sure
can you
that,
do? Yeah. Yeah.
yes, um, and asking those questions and probing more. So if you see like look at your assessment that you have at your workplace and making sure you're having questions around this because as we mentioned, some of these disabilities are not visible and we don't want to assume. We want to provide and support our clients with the correct services here. So thank you so much for providing those two resources there that we can look a little
They're
bit deeper.
both excellent and for different reasons. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're both excellent.
And some of the clinicians joining in, listening into this session today are supervisors, administrators,
Mhm.
case managers, and leaders. So how can
Mhm.
they promote ADA compliance and disability inclusions at a system level?
I think the most important thing as a supervisor is just really observing what's going on with your team. I can't stress enough the importance of one-on-one meetings and what you can learn from one-on-one meetings. I also, if you have an employee who's struggling with performance, while yes, there are disciplinary protocols and processes to improve employment, also probe, is there anything else going on that you need help with? You are not asking them directly, tell me your medical history or anything like that. Is there something that would help you with your job? So you really have to have your eyes and ears open. And particularly, I've noticed as a longtime manager, if someone has been a great employee and all of a sudden they're struggling, that's typically not your usual performance issue. Those are ones you want to look at and say, is something going on in their life? Is there something that they need to ask for help? It could be even a simple question like, is there anything I can help you with? Is there anything you want to talk about to probe?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And you have so many years of experience here. How has the conversation around disability and workplace accommodations changed, where we still
Yeah.
have significant work to do?
What I can say, what's changed for the favorable is as technology increased, and one of the only few things that was good about COVID is we realized there were many roles that can be done remotely. And for a disabled employee, remote work might be the difference between them being able to work and them being unemployed. So that's a favorable thing. Increased technology and for the appropriate job, being able to work at home. I still think there's work around mental health. That is a tough one. I mean, you had excellent questions about the invisible disabilities. And those are the harder ones for the manager and the harder ones for their coworkers because the employee might look totally well. But I can't stress enough, it's a confidential process, and that if there is chatter going on or employee concerns, those need to be nipped in the bud. They really do, because you run the risk of violating that employee's rights.
Most definitely. And as clinicians, it's so important for us to see this like from all the way around, from the client having a new diagnosis and supporting them through that
Ugh,
in the workforce.
yes,
I'm also thinking of what I've seen with some of my clients is there's a very critical time to where they take a significant amount of leave, maybe 3 to 4 months, depending on what their insurance is approving.
yes,
And there's this fear of returning back to this environment that
yes.
brought
And
back.
that might be an accommodation, phasing them back into work. I
Okay.
left a 5-day-a-week position where I was working 10 hours a day and, checking my email at midnight. And now I have a health concern, a serious health concern, and maybe they can't come back right away 5 days a week. And having that flexibility, I always try to encourage to managers, let's do a pilot. Let's see how this works. We're here from you. We know you have to meet business needs, and the goal is the job gets fully done. That's what the ADA is. It's doing the entire job, but with an accommodation.
Awesome. Thank you. Because we can see this from time to time, depending on the role that we're playing as
Yeah.
clinicians. And
Yes.
to close here, what are some maybe some three things that you would want every clinician here to remember when supporting someone who may need a workplace accommodation?
I think the first thing is to be aware that many clients are not going to say, I need an accommodation. So to really listen for that, for the clues, are they struggling? Is this something they've always struggled in, or is this something new that they're struggling in? Are they having job performance? Is this child not being able to take the tests in the time allotted? Look for those clues because it's a rare client that's going to say, I need an accommodation. They may not know about it. The second thing is you to serve as an advocate, to help guide them, to use the tools like the EEOC website to know that they have rights. Now that doesn't mean that they have to be an expert on every leave, but have an awareness that there are these rights and leaves and accommodations out there, and talk to the employee. Have you looked at your policies online or in your manual or whatever your company uses? Have you spoken to your HR about what's available to you? So being that advocate. And then I think the third thing is supporting them because many employees are fearful. I don't want to raise my hand. I don't, I need this job. And if I say I need an accommodation, they're going to get rid of me. The reality is, if you're struggling on your job, you have a far better chance at success if you can get an accommodation that enables you to fully do the job. Then you have a win-win. So those are the three things that I would recommend.
Thank you so much, Hilly. I really appreciate all of your knowledge here, and I hope those listening in today can take away something for your clients, for yourselves, because we're human beings as well. Sometimes there's things that are coming up for us,
Absolutely.
and being able to speak up and ask for the support that's needed here. And as we see here, some of those learning objectives of being able to identify these provisions, describe the steps involved as you moved us through, the best practices there, and of course, apply our professional skills to support these individuals that are going through these things and being very empathetic as they're going through this, because as we mentioned, it's a very difficult time. It's something new, most likely to navigate. And so we're wanting to advocate and support our clients in this. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share our resources here. So now we should be able to see our key resources here. And I went ahead and included some of those websites that Hillary mentioned. So eeoc.gov and askjan.org. Making sure you check out those websites for those further details for yourself or your clients to really look at, does this fall into ADA or something else to support your client and further process this in a session. So thank you again so much for your time today and all of your insightful information to cover this. Again, I really hope that you all can take something away to better serve your clients.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.